Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Hello, and welcome back to The Eurofile. This week, we're going to cover really big elections in Central and Eastern Europe. Obviously, the biggest one is Hungary's stunning rejection of Viktor Orbán after 16 years in power. And more recently, Bulgaria's 8th election in 5 years, which brought former President Rumen Radev to the premiership on an anti-corruption platform. After that, we'll turn to Max's conversation with Ben McWilliams, who's an affiliate fellow at Bruegel on the energy fallout from the Iran war. Let's dive in. Max, everybody's eyes were fixed on Budapest on April 12. I was actually having a fantastic weekend because one, I was in France having amazing food. Two, I was watching Rory McIlroy win the Masters for the second year in a row, which only 3 other people have done, and that was fantastic. The prodigal son of Northern Ireland. Most importantly, I was watching the returns from Hungary, which was just mind-boggling. Obviously, we've all been looking at this election. You and I have talked about it a lot. We've done interviews about this, and we weren't sure which way it was going to go. Obviously, the polling was really showing TISA, the party led by Péter Magyar, leading Orbán and Fidesz, but they really swept. It was incredible. They won 53% of the vote, which in a way, in Fidesz's new electoral system meant that they won a 2/3 supermajority and got 141 seats in the National Assembly. That is really incredible.
It was a total wipeout. It was
Completely.
a crushing defeat for Fidesz and for Viktor Orbán. You could see it on the night, and he conceded incredibly quickly. And that was probably one of the most surprising things. I think a lot of non-Hungarian watchers of this election were like, how is this guy going to leave power? And really worried. And I have to admit, worried of kind of like a Euromaidan situation taking place in Budapest. And maybe that acted as a constraint on Orbán. But I think if the election was close, there were concerns about what he would do. But this was just such a sizable defeat that there wasn't really anything I think he could do. And maybe just a quick thought on this is that I think this is where being in the EU actually makes a huge difference. And we have, for more than a decade, lambasted the EU for not standing up for rule of law and democracy and allowing democratic rollback. And all of those critiques are true. But there was a clear ceiling or governor on what Orbán could do in terms of turning Hungary into an actual liberal autocracy. You know, the rules of the democratic game were completely, in his favor. State media, the money in politics, how the state was being used to advance his political project. All of that was true. But you could still say what you wanted, basically, in Hungary. There could be some retribution economically, but freedom of speech, other things were protected. And so I think there's a reason why Hungary did not go down the path of Turkey and Erdogan or Belarus and Lukashenko and other places that have gone the direction of strongman autocratic rule that have just continued to perpetuate in power, despite the fact that the population begins to really turn against them. And so I think the EU should, really slap itself on the back. And maybe another thought is that the whole narrative about the failing EU, every time I would talk to anyone about the EU, it's always, well, what about Hungary? What about the far right? Obviously, the EU is failing, about to collapse. And, that narrative just got exploded because here is a pro-European party movement candidate. Now, what it actually means, we can discuss. But Europe was on the ballot here. The EU was on the ballot in this election, and the EU won. A lot goes into a wave election, but that was clearly part of this. The fear of potentially Hungary being ostracized and kicked out of the European Union and other things were a real concern. And the Hungarians want to be part of the EU. Not being part of the EU is like unfathomable. I think a really important election for all sorts of reasons that we can get into. But, from my personal standpoint, it means that next time I talk about the EU and how it's actually not failing, someone can't, raise their hand. I was at a talk recently and someone was like, what about Hungary? And I was like, we'll see what happens. And what happened was Europe won in this election.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting debate about were we overstating the level of democratic decay in Hungary and all of these rankings, et cetera, because, well, turns out it's possible to get him out of power. I think for that, 2 things are true at the same time. One, it did require a lot of things to align for TISA to win this way. They needed a lot of active campaigning on the ground, a lot of resources to do that. They had an incredibly effective leader in Peter Magyar. We have to recognize that. His standing also as a conservative person and a former Fidesz insider was really important because he understood the machine that he was up against, which was not necessarily the case for the former opponents that have lost repeatedly. There was an incredible, and I cannot state this enough, incredible work from investigative journalists in Hungary who have done, it's felt like the last few weeks, every week, almost every day, there was a new report on amazing things happening inside, amazing in the bad way, I guess, inside the Hungarian government. Obviously, the leaks from the foreign minister to Sergei Lavrov in Russia, but everything else, also things that really matter to people in Hungary every day, from the state of the healthcare system, et cetera. So that played a big role. The ability to work on like really effective counter disinformation, the international support, but also TISA not leaning into that international support so that they could stay away from accusations of foreign interference. So lots of stars.
I think you're missing one big thing too, and that was just Peter Magyar was just like an unbelievably skilled politician.
Sure, yeah.
Probably one of the most skilled politicians I've ever seen in my life was Barack Obama, where, you know, in the 2008 Democratic primary, all these arrows being slotted and somehow sort of dodging them like he's Neo in the Matrix. And I mean, no political candidate I can ever remember has had that much stuff thrown at him and somehow been able to just turn it against Orbán. Just really politically masterful performance. And one thing I should say, Orbán tilted the playing field. It required, I think, probably a once in a generation politician. And this is not a judgment on how he will be as leader of Hungary, but a once in a generation politician. And, you know, the entire political spectrum uniting behind him, even though there are, you know, real disagreements, to have this victory and defeat Orbán showed the stakes that were here. And also it's probably good luck of what happened.
And it's very hard to draw a comprehensive list of everything that needed to be brought together to defeat him. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it's also true that the system that Orbán created was the tool of his downfall. Because as we mentioned at the top, the electoral system, the way it was built with those like bonus seats, I don't want to get into the detail because it's pretty complex, but those are things that made it so that if you win 53% of the vote, you can get 141 seats of a 199 seat assembly. That's just crazy. So that is what kind of turned on Orbán, and he overshot. I think he and his coalition overshot. They really played up the Ukraine thing, the war thing, at a time where really the concerns were on everyday life things. So those are things that I think we can hold in our heads at the same time.
Yeah, and the other thing, and we'll talk about this with Dan Kellerman, an expert on Hungary and the EU, not in this episode, but in the next episode, about, you know, what are the lessons learned from how the EU approached Hungary? I think one of the things, though, is that the EU held back a ton of funding, and that, you know, Dan in particular critiqued the EU again and again and again for not throwing the book at Orbán for the rule of law violations. And they had finally started to do that and had a real negative economic impact on Hungary. And so I think when we project forward of what does this mean? Well, there's a lot of talk about what this means for the far right movement sort of globally and in Europe, because the Hungarians were really funding a lot of it. There's a story about them maybe funding CPAC, which, you know, might raise bar violations, but we'll see. But to me, the real signal and message from this is that, A, if you push it too far in how anti-EU you're going to move your country, there's going to be a backlash against you that will be really strong. B, that the EU now has tools and leverage that they could push back against you, both through the court decision that just happened, but holding back funding. So that's something to reckon with. And C, you could totally be ostracized like within Europe, and that European leaders were getting really frustrated with the obstructionism. And this is why Orbán, up until the last few years, really, he had always played this game, or not always, but over the last decade, where could make deals with him and compromise. And so there was never worth really going after him and confronting the problem. It just was easier to buy it off. But I think now it's going to be harder to play that game. And so I think this leaves the far right, I think, an anti-EU far right, somewhat not cornered, but it basically puts a limit on how far they can go. And so I think doesn't mean that we're going to see Ukraine in the EU tomorrow, or that they're going to have breakthroughs and have a new treaty to reform, off their unanimous decision making on all sorts of things. But I think we're going to see the ability pushing back toward getting stuff done in consensus.
Yeah, for sure. I think among the top level impacts going forward for this election is, of course, the consequences for this sort of like far right intellectual machine, which the Hungarian government was funding through different channels. There's obviously the question of Ukraine. As you say, we're not talking about membership. Tomorrow, Magyar has made that very clear. He is not particularly pro-membership for Ukraine. But most likely, we're going to see the lifting of the veto from Hungary on this 90 billion euros for Ukraine.
Orbán might even lift it beforehand. Yeah.
Well, he knows that things are over for him for now. But there's a question of whether he tries to come back, obviously. There's obviously a mood change for the European Union in the next council, although not the one that's happening this week. There is an informal European Council where Orbán will still be there. It's going to be a very awkward goodbye council, but I'm sure all of them will be quite happy about that. And then there's some second, third order consequences that I think are really interesting to look at. You talk about all these funds that are frozen. Magyar has already been having meetings with European officials from the Commission on how they can undo this. There's significant rule of law reforms that need to happen, but there's a deadline for the end of August that's coming up for 10 billion euros to be unfrozen. Otherwise, they're lost, fully lost. That's massive money for Hungary. There's going to be a lot of purging of Fidesz loyalists in the government. There's super interesting conversations about the drawing of a new constitution. How often do we get to see this inside the European Union? I find this super interesting. And then there's real everyday impacts on judicial independence, press freedom, and then things like joining the European Public Prosecutor's Office, which means us learning a lot more about potential misuse of EU funds that have happened since maybe 2017. It depends when they choose the retroactivity to take place. But so much stuff can happen, and Magyar is already drawing up these plans. And I think that's what's really important to note is this roadmap to recovery is already underway. And he is taking this very seriously because he understands the machinery of the state.
Maybe one sort of final thought on Hungary is, to me, what this really demonstrates is the real political division inside of Europe. Their political cleavage, to use a political science term, is the pro-European, anti-European dividing line. And by pro-European, I mean in favor of strengthening Europe, of being part of Europe. And that ultimately in European politics, that is the base issue. So, if you go to the Danish election that happened, it wasn't really about Europe because it was about bike lanes and other things like that animate Danish politics.
The minks.
Yes. Or in Dutch politics, it was about, fertilizer and manure and other things like that. Because there is a general agreement amongst the majority of the center-right, center-left parties, left, and even parties on the left and right, about their place in the European Union is not at question. But at the end of the day, if the election is about basically, do we want to stay in Europe? That wasn't the full issue here. There was a lot of corruption and all these other things. But really, why did everyone on the left join and back a center-right politician against the far right? It was because this was about Hungary's future in Europe. And I think when we look ahead to the French elections, that strikes me as the major dividing line between the far right and sort of everyone else that can't agree on anything. And can they agree on rally around a certain candidate? But the question will come down to Europe. And I think part of what we'll probably see from the far right in France is trying to neutralize that, trying to not be seen as anti-Europe. Because this is what Macron did in 2017 vis-a-vis Le Pen, was he hugged the EU flag after Brexit and said that, she would bring more disarray. And it worked, and he won a great victory. So to me, this is, at the end of the day, the cleavage that matters is the pro-European, anti-European. And I think this was a very big win for that force in Europe.
Yeah. The one difference I would make, which maybe is on the margins, but still, someone like Macron is an EU ideologue. He is really bought into it. Magyar is, I would say, more of an EU pragmatist because he's also quite nationalistic in some ways. So he is pro-EU. Also, his party is part of the EPP. He is part of that center-ish. But on the whole, I agree with you. He's not out there to dismantle the system.
But that doesn't mean, what I mean by pro-EU, it doesn't mean that he had to be like, Magyar had to be super federalist or whatever. It didn't mean that he had to, be singing Ode to Joy.
Just not railing against the system all the time.
Right. It's that, no, Hungary's place is in Europe, and we're going to try to shape Europe in a good direction. You can then have disagreements about what that actually means between center right and center left. But the ultimate like cleavage that super matters in Europe is like, are you for this thing or are you against this project?
Yep.
Like, and that leads us to maybe just quickly on the election in Bulgaria, because suddenly there's like, who's the next Orbán? Who's the next
forgot
Orbán?
Because it was just a week after the Hungarian elections.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Bulgaria had, as we said at the top, its, millionth election or eighth in the last 5 years. It's just a lot of political fatigue, obviously. But what's important is the size of the win by former President Rumen Radev, his party Progressive Bulgaria, which won like 45%-ish roughly of the vote. And that is the largest margin we've seen in Bulgaria's recent elections, which was just a lot of fragmentation for a long time. So what we're likely to see from this is potentially the most stable government to come into power in a very long time. Critically, he won against former Prime Minister Boyko Borisov, who was also accused of insane corruption, just like a very, also, sad, but also very funny figure in Bulgarian politics. And Radev won on the basis of this big anti-corruption platform. There was interesting work on cracking down on vote buying, all the kinds of electoral shenanigans you can imagine. So that's pretty good. I think what's most important out of this election is it's just kind of a tricky spot. It's a good thing, I think, that Borisov's coalition did not come back to power. We know what he can do. So Radev is right about all the amount of corruption that exists, the cronyism in Bulgaria, this oligarchic governance model. But he's also quite pro-Russia, and he has never hidden this. He was like that when he was president. He is likely to be like this now, which could be a problem for the European Union. So we're kind of stuck in this spot.
Just a few quick thoughts. So Bulgaria has been one of the most pro-Russian countries inside of Europe. There's a religious link. They're Eastern Orthodox. They've long had ties to modern day Russia, Soviet Union, obviously. So this is not that shocking in terms of Bulgarian politics. It's not sort of out of the ordinary. But there was also a lot of experts on Bulgaria sort of tamped down concerns. Oh my God, he's going to be the next Orbán. And that Bulgaria is incredibly dependent on the EU. Also, Hungary was part of the first wave of countries to join NATO, to join the EU. Bulgaria came later. And I do think there would be a much greater willingness for the EU to kind of throw the book at Bulgaria than there is on Hungary, that if we're going to see Bulgaria be really obstructionist, and all the constraints that I mentioned, I think will exist there. And so I think where we're going to look at is that Bulgaria is not going to be active in pushing for Russia sanctions and other things, and they may try to, negotiate a little bit on this. I can't see them being that obstructionist. And if so, then, the EU has some experience of what to do. And maybe with that, we'll turn to our interview with Ben McWilliams. We are thrilled to welcome Ben McWilliams to the Eurofile. Ben is an affiliate fellow at Bruegel, where he specializes in energy and climate policy. His work focuses on European energy security, clean technology deployment, and the industrial implications of the energy transition. He's been tracking Europe's energy markets closely, so he is a perfect guest to bring back on the Eurofile to discuss what's happening in global energy markets and what's happening right now in the European Union. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Nice to be back.
So maybe we could start by talking about the state of play. What is currently happening in Europe and European energy markets? We hear, I think, a lot about how shortages are starting to appear, particularly in Asia. We're sort of well into, I don't even know what week this war is, but we're looking at the second month or third month of this war. What's the energy situation presently in Europe and the Europe?
I think we'll have to break it down into oil and gas, which are two quite different situations. I actually think natural gas is looking perhaps a lot better than people might be thinking or have expected, and whereas oil looks pretty tough. So, let's begin with oil. Of course, the Strait being closed, everybody knows the number by now, that's about a fifth of supply. What we've seen so far is a price impact. You hear discussion of shortages and kind of the fact that, in Italy, you hear about airports kind of making plans for what they would do in the case of shortages. well, we haven't seen any widespread shortages. You hear some noises about some things going on, but that's not really the situation that we're in yet. But we're in a situation of extremely high prices. The price of jet fuel is doubled in Europe. Price of diesel is over €2 a litre. I cannot do the quick math in my head for what that is per gallon, but you'll
No, nobody can. Nobody knows.
something
To
in gallons, but
paraphrase.
30-40% price increase for kind of petrol and diesel. So that's what, Europeans going to the petrol station are seeing, a 30 or 40% jump in prices, which is clearly enormous. And everybody is talking about it and people are not happy. That's oil. Natural gas, I think, is a little bit less concerning. And it might, of course, get worse. But just in terms of what we're seeing in price at the moment, we're still seeing LNG coming to Europe. Europe has still, for the time being, been able to compete for kind of flexible cargoes. And we're seeing a TTF price, actually today, it's almost back at 40. It's been closer to 50 over the last couple of weeks. And again, that compares to 30. So probably €30 a megawatt hour. So we're about a 3% increase, which is still significant. Everything in Europe in terms of gas is thought through in terms of sort of 2022, where we got to kind of 200. So it's not to diminish what happens today, but it's a much smaller price increase. And for the time being, Europe has been attracting LNG. Now, for Europe, the question, of course, over the summer months in the gas market is about filling storages, which is the nice thing. It's not as much, if this was happening in November, it would be much more serious, because now Europe at least has a few months where the question is not how can the person keep their home warm. The question is rather how can you play with the market to ensure that you get enough in storage for the winter months, which is still a challenge, and which we'll see how it goes over the next weeks and months.
And maybe you could describe to us a little bit about the differences in the electricity markets across Europe, because what we're seeing is that Italy, their energy prices are now incredibly high, while a country like Spain with a more diversified energy mix, France being a very nuclear focused, energy prices aren't quite as high. So there's a lot of discrepancy across Europe. And why is that?
Yeah, I think it's been, from an energy perspective, one of the really striking things that we've seen since the Iran attacks is exactly as you described, that the European power market is breaking up a little bit. It had been even for a few months before this, but European power market, if it's perfectly designed and if it got where Europeans would like it to get to, you have kind of the perfect flow of electricity around and prices equalize. And you still have Germany, Hungary, Czechia, Poland, sort of Central Eastern Europe, where there's basically enough interconnection capacity and they have kind of trade around and prices there are equalized. You have the couple of exceptions that you've mentioned, basically, which are on two extremes of the story. One is Italy, who is still heavily reliant on natural gas, who quite simply haven't deployed enough renewables quickly enough. And you can see that if you look into the kind of the prices there, there's still hours of the day. In other markets, you get to kind of solar cannibalization. In Italy, far from there yet. And what we're seeing is Italian prices are above the rest of Europe, A, because of the gas, and B, because the interconnection capacity is basically maxed out. And then on the flip side of that, you see Spain, Portugal, who are connected to Europe only through France with the enormous nuclear capacity. And they're essentially not connected to the wider European market. And at least for the last 6 weeks, what we've seen is that there's some nuclear in Spain as well, and solar and wind, a bit of hydro, have most days just been more than load. So you've had more clean, kind of marginally free generation, which has meant prices have been really, really low, like, globally competitively low. It's only 6 weeks, and of course that can change as conditions change, and we'll see how this goes. But that's a bit the breakup that we're seeing. Again, as a whole, prices are 80, 90 euros a megawatt hour wholesale prices in sort of Germany and that kind of big blob where they can trade freely. In Italy, more like 120. So they're up a bit, but it's not some crazy jump from 6 months ago. Something to be monitored and thought about, but we're not in this kind of, for electricity specifically and gas, not in this kind of 2022 world of a crazy energy crisis like I think we probably are in oil.
And just for context, before 2022, before Russian gas exploded and stopped flowing, what were the rough prices? So, my understanding is that prices were actually incredibly low, or quite low in Europe. Then you had the crisis, prices skyrocketed. They came down, but at a higher floor than what we saw pre-2022. So where are they now, sort of versus 2021?
Yeah, I think that's broadly an accurate take. I mean, if you look at natural gas you're looking at something around 20 euros a megawatt hour in the years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. you actually had the COVID effect where prices were even depressed for a couple of years before that as demand came off. And then they jumped, enormously. And then they were kind of gradually settling back down. Again, in gas was back down to about 30 euros a megawatt hour. So 50% up from where it used to be, but nowhere near where it was during the crisis. Typical benchmark is that electricity is double that, just with gas setting the marginal cost. And it was, they have been gradually creeping up, basically with more and more taxes and levies, expanding grids. They've been like marginally increasing in Europe. But no, I think that idea of being lower before, jumping a lot during the crisis, coming back down, and now we're seeing again a little jump, but not a jump at all like we saw in 2022, but still a jump from levels that were already kind of coming back down to where they used to be. So it's still, particularly for heavy industry, where you have these international competitiveness challenges, it's still definitely a concern and something people in Europe are worried about.
One of the things that we saw in Europe after the energy crisis was both a curtailment of demand. I think the Commission set a target of reducing overall European energy demand by like 15%. So if you were in Europe in the winter of 2022, 2023, you saw government buildings, turning off the lights at night, and Europeans hate air conditioning, but they definitely weren't running as much air conditioning. The heater and the thermostat during the winter was turned down. But we also saw like a major increase in renewables, where I think if my math is right, it was roughly around 20% of Europe's energy generation prior to the crisis was renewables. Fossil, I think, was around 40%. And now they're roughly equal, with renewables, I think, above at 30%. Even countries like Hungary under Viktor Orbán, we think of being very retrograde. Massive deployment of solar, where I think at some points solar got to roughly 40% of Hungary's energy generation. We can check those stats later. But I'm curious, so we've seen an increase there. Does Europe just need to do more of that? What do you think now is the problem? And what's the story on the electrification side? Because it seems like that was rather flat. The EV adoption has increased, but maybe not at the same rate as the deployment of renewables. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what were the kind of responses there on renewables and electrification after the 2022 crisis?
I think that's a great description of what happened, which is that on renewables, Europe really doubled down. And if you look since 2021 even, it was von der Leyen coming in and the Commission, and it was already beginning before the Russian invasion of Ukraine and starting to move, but that really turbocharged everything. And on renewables, you've seen big growth. And what does it take to get it kind of over the finishing line? I think you have this situation where you build a lot of renewables, but the way that electricity market works is that you can build as much renewables as you like, but when you still have gas setting at the margin for many hours of the year, you don't yet see the effect. And, the models would show us that at some point you reach a bit of a tipping point when you start getting more and more hours when renewables are at the margin, and then consumers start to see the benefit of the lower wholesale prices, at least. Of course, there's a whole world of PPAs and contracts for difference. So, and we sometimes simplify things and look only at wholesale prices, but there's more to it. But I think Spain's a good story there, where you kind of see this happening. And I think for many countries now, it's still a few more years of more renewables, and they will reach that point where they start seeing more and more hours with basically cheap prices. But that's only one side of the story, as you say. The other side is the electrification. And I think that's somewhere where Europe moved since the crisis in 2022 and did do some things. We saw heat pumps, for example, particularly in the 1-2 years after the invasion surging, but then they came back down again. The European Commission was going to come with a heat pump action plan, which was forgotten about. Electric vehicles have been growing. Now it's about 1 in 5 new cars in Europe are an electric vehicle, which, is still pretty significant. But for example, it was only 6 months ago, Europe was revising its 2035 electric vehicle target downwards, which now doesn't really look like the smartest policy with what we see today. And I think that's the big lesson now for Europe, and the kind of structurally way forward thinking about this is electrification. I think on the clean energy deployment, on the renewables deployment, we still need more of them, but the markets are set up, the systems are set up, that's being built, that's coming into the system pretty much as fast as it can. The Commission keeps working on permitting and speeding that up, but renewables are being built across the board. And even nuclear, some countries go back and it will take a lot longer to build, but they'll try to build that. I think the thing where European leaders really need to think about is on the electrification side, and ensuring that this clean electricity is being used in places, as I would say, where it hurts. So particularly households who you really want to kind of insulate from these fossil price shocks, which is things like heat pumps and electric vehicles, and trying to get as many consumers as you can away from this sort of cycle of every 3 or 4 years we have a fossil fuel crisis, trying to insulate as many consumers as you can. which I think is the direction Europe is going. And I think the lesson will be taken to kind of double down on that, and doing that in a smart way is the challenge.
That's a good pivot to the present crisis. EU Energy Commissioner Dan Jorgensen recently said that if the war ends tomorrow, prices are not going to immediately normalize in the foreseeable future. You've already talked about how gas and oil prices, how they've gone. I think there's something like Europe added 14 billion euros to its fossil fuel import in the first month of this conflict. And, this puts real inflationary pressure on the European economy, challenges European competitiveness, but also impacts consumers rather directly. What are some of the steps that we're seeing right now from European governments? What are they doing to try to, help protect their publics from some of the cost increases and some of their businesses? Are these sort of self-defeating in the long term? Maybe you could just talk about what sort of policy actions we're seeing across the bloc.
Yeah, well, I think a major thing, kind of a preferred tool of governments at the moment, is knocking off taxes on petrol and diesel, which of course you can sympathize with, and you're the prime minister of Italy or of another European country and diesel prices go through the roof. It's tempting to do this, and I can see where they're coming from, but it's clearly dangerous and risky because prices are not going up because there's some evil system, or there's some evil people maybe, but there's no evil system. Prices go up because there isn't a supply. And you need to have a demand side reduction, a demand side response to equalize the global oil market. It's just that simple. Now, you can try and play with prices, but if Japan, China, everybody's playing with prices, all you're doing is just keeping the market hot and keeping the demand there. And it's kind of a race to the bottom. And at the end of the day, you're knocking the taxes off to the person who's driving the petrol car or the diesel car, not pay it, but they're still paying it through their taxes. I mean, it's being paid. It's not that oil is cheaper when your government knocks the taxes off. So I think that's something where government should be really careful. And again, I understand the politics of it, of course, and we're seeing a little bit of that so far. And I think much more targeted measures would be the desired policy, trying to identify who in society is really exposed to this and really struggles by this, and getting money to them. And one probably quite sad thing from 2022 is that I think governments still kind of struggle to do that. The typical answer is, it's too costly, it's too hard administratively to get it to those people. We don't know who they are, we don't have the data, which is the same thing in 2022, the same thing in 1970. You think one lesson from this has to be, we need better data. We need to understand if there is another fossil energy crisis, as there will be, let's be a bit better prepared so we know, okay, these are the households who are on the edge of energy poverty, and really we have to help through this winter. They need the help. And these are the other 85% of households in the economy who, okay, they're not happy that the gas price goes up, but they can pay it, they can survive, and which means government money will go far further to kind of manage these crises. And then the other big thing is you have to think more longer term about this and more structurally, and do things with a vision of the future, which is, as we just discussed, things basic. I think electrification has to be the big lesson from this. And, the market will be pushed in this direction from this crisis, but there's so many inefficiencies. You still need government help to get over the line in many of these cases, financial, but also regulation and also permitting and all of the above, to kind of make a big push there and be sure that you're not responding in the short term. Maybe one last point on it would be that so far, at least fiscally, we're trying ourselves to pull a bit together the measures as others have done. It's far smaller so far than it was in 2022. We haven't done the exact calculation yet, but if you add up the euro billions that governments are preparing to kind of push into the economy as fiscal stimulus, it's really, really significantly smaller in 2022, which I guess partly maybe is because they're still kind of sizing up the crisis and seeing where it goes. Partly perhaps just governments haven't got the budget, or they're worried they haven't got the fiscal space to do these things. But it looks like so far we see something much smaller than we did in 2022.
That's really interesting. I mean, in 2022, I think the German industrial associations, at least in the spring of 2022, were kind of predicting that if Russian gas stopped flowing, that it would cause a depression in Germany. That didn't come to pass, but part of the reason it didn't come to pass was massive state aid or fiscal interventions by the German state and other governments. Is that something you expect to see? I mean, that's being discussed, I think, at the EU level about loosening some of its state aid rules. But is industry across Europe really at risk here with high prices? And are they going to need sort of more state intervention? It is still early. I think I've been shocked that markets have not completely freaked out yet and sort of waffle back and forth. So it's sort of understandable that governments would still be in kind of a wait and see pose if markets are in the same place. But where do you expect this to go, at least when it comes to, do you think Berlin is going to have to, open up the fiscal taps to support its industry. And so the second question from that is, should they do that? Does that make sense to do?
It's a lot. We discussed a bit natural gas, and again, 45 euros a megawatt hour. It's 20% of LNG that's offline. A fifth of it's destroyed even for at least 3 or 4 years, and the rest of it for sure wouldn't come back quickly if the Strait opened tomorrow. And it seems the price is 40 euros a megawatt hour. That I think, Jake, the Japanese LNG price is similar. That seems to be the price that, I don't know. I mean, if you believe the market, that's the price which causes the necessary demand reduction, which also to me seems far lower than I would have expected. Again, let's wait and see how it goes in a few weeks and months, and if it jumps and grows over time. I think from 2022, that's also one, not just the fiscal stimulus, I think meant that the hit to GDP was lower, but it was also the demand side response. I think a lot of those models that they ran, what would it mean if Russian gas got cut off? Part of the reason why the scenario looked so much worse was because the elasticity and the ability to reduce gas demand in certain places without it passing through kind of one-to-one throughout the economy was far better, in a sense of less economically harmful than expected. So I think that's one perhaps positive. I think the natural gas price will be, on an industrial side, because of the pass-through into electricity, really key for how much governments have to think about in terms of fiscally supporting industry. I think in that space, it's still wait and see how it looks. And then you come basically to the question, what do you do about oil and the fact that diesel is expensive, kerosene is expensive, which is going to hurt? I guess my base case is the governments will act and they will do some things, but still nothing. I don't expect things kind of on the order of what we saw in 2022 for now, based largely on what I see and hear, and also based on that it's not valid. Not that it's not necessary, but that they don't necessarily have the space. And at some point, you have to let these shocks kind of come in. And it's as hard as it is to say, you have to let these shocks kind of come in and push the economy and kind of push the efficiency gains and shift in energy in the economy.
I guess maybe let's say the fiscal space is there. Let's say the EU does what it did in response to COVID, where a next-gen EU loan borrowing scheme to really help the economies of Spain and Italy and others throughout Europe. And I think that's generally, we've discussed on the show, seen as somewhat successful, even if it was sort of slower in how it acted. When it comes to the energy and clean transition side, let's just say, something like that was on the table again. Oh my God, Europe's looking at a massive energy crisis. It seems pretty clear that you want to avoid a stagflationary environment.
Mm-hmm.
So, every gas-powered car you take off the road and switch it to an EV, you've suddenly, reduced your oil demand. What are some of the things that you think are necessary or could be on the offing for European policymakers? Dan Jorgensen calls you and says, okay, Ben, what do we do? There's no limit to the budget. We can put it in there. What are the steps that the EU and member state governments as well should be taking right now?
If we maybe start, you need a couple of short-term measures for getting through today. And then I think much of the money should be on the longer-term structural stuff. Short-term would be about ensuring that the gas storages are filled this summer, where if I could have the magic wand, it would be at the European level. It would be coordinated. You need some kind of smart contract for difference, because you don't want to, the market itself will fill the storages. So you need smart people that me can design the mechanism, but some mechanism that kind of just equates and gets the necessary few euros in to ensure that the forward curve looks correct and you get the storages filled over the summer would be number one. Targeted support to vulnerable households, which we already discussed, and the best you're able to target that, do that. And then, also for companies, a little bit perhaps of some support. Things like the diesel price being up, that's going to hurt. And there can perhaps be some case that some targeted support over the next months to get through makes sense. But I would be keeping it roughly at this in terms of today's short term, or looking at the short term question. And much of the money, all of the money needs to be going in electrification solutions, where you can still play with things a bit that can be, it's not that every electrification solution is a 5-year thing. Some of them are building solar panels, deploying batteries. You can do very quickly an emergency program to get heat pumps into homes. You could double or increase by a third, kind of heat pump deployment this year, which will already next winter be having an impact. A nuclear power plant, keep talking about them and thinking about them, but of course that's not going to help you for 10 years. Not that you should keep, it's not every crisis, nuclear takes 10 years, let's forget about it. You have to have that conversation, but it's not the one that's going to solve you today. Even wind turbines a bit slower than solar. So yeah, a couple of these short-term things, gas storages, some vulnerable households, maybe some vulnerable companies, but then the majority of it on structural solutions to reduce fossil fuel imports, which the majority, I think, needs to be electrification.
In the US and during the Biden administration, we had the Inflation Reduction Act. And, the US is different than the EU. We can, in the US, directly target consumers. Before Donald Trump killed the EV tax credit, I took advantage of that. And suddenly my fossil fuel consumption has collapsed. So before September, we were doing some home renovations, got a heat pump, hot water heater, and now have heat pump instead of natural gas boiler. And there was all these incentives for that. Now, there was debate about whether, someone, I should be getting those incentives. But it strikes me that there is, a lot of variance across the European Union. We looked at Bulgaria, for instance, and most of the cars on the road, I think, are over 15 years old. And their EV adoption is incredibly low. And now you have a sputtering German car industry. What would the Americans do in this situation? Well, you could do a cash for clunkers, get people on EVs, spur your auto industry. I know that's hard for the EU to execute, but do you think this crisis could sort of spur those sorts of initiatives, maybe at the national level or in a coordinated way? Because it does strike me, well, you have EVs, you could, switch out your taxi fleets and other things like that, where the government comes in, spends a lot of money up front, but you've suddenly reduced oil demand quite quickly and therefore, hopefully brought down inflation, and that's overall beneficial to the economy.
I think it makes a lot of sense. And the good thing now is that clean energy industries are at such a point that you can use them as a fiscal stimulus, that when we're talking about EVs, it's about, a couple of €1,000 subsidy to ensure that to get a typical consumer over the line to buying one today from a German company with a supply chain in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and get that driving today, which not only has the climate benefit, which we don't even talk about, but the energy security benefit, but also the fiscal stimulus benefit. And I think those kind of policies make a lot of sense. And that's exactly the way government should be thinking and are thinking. I mean, on EVs, governments do currently have, not Bulgaria, I don't know the situation in Bulgaria, whether they have a subsidy yet, but Germany, for example, has now for about 12 months now, they reintroduced their EV subsidies. Other countries have them, Spain, France. And we are seeing it growing there. You can try and push it further. And no, I mean, I agree. This makes sense for fiscal stimulus purposes and energy security purposes, and is really a no-brainer in the current crisis. And trying as much as possible to get your money in that direction rather than these temptations in the short term of, knocking off 10 cents a litre from the diesel price, which is an extremely costly policy, is really the way to do smart government.
I have two final questions. Maybe the first one is about energy union. Energy has not been a sole competency of the European Union, but the EU has sort of grown in the Commission. His role in coordinating Europe's energy policies has really increased. What are some of the things that you think are needed structurally? We started this conversation talking about how power prices vary across the European Union. There's a lot of complaints in Spain when they had their energy blackout. They couldn't get power from France. France is notoriously sort of blocked, whether it's pipelines or other energy interconnections. Is that when we think of an energy union, is grid interconnection between countries, is that sort of the key thing that needs to happen? What else are we talking about there?
Yeah, I think on energy union, Europe has been quite successful at building that union in terms of dispatch, in terms of in any given hour of the day, prices in different countries kind of pull electricity across, and natural gas. We discussed Italy and Spain, a couple of exceptions, but generally Europe's done a good job. That we have a market that at 1 hour and day ahead, it works quite well, and electricity flows and can improve, build more grid connections, etc. It can improve, but works reasonably well. What Europe completely lacks is, in the kind of 5-year and 10-year game, the investments. I mean, investments are still fundamentally driven at the national level, which is partly, as you say, because energy is a member state competence, and there's a lot of difficult political questions. But if you are Europe and you want to have an efficient energy system, it's not enough to have an energy union only of the dispatch, only of the 30 minutes, the 1 hour ahead market. You also need to be making investments smartly around Europe and ensuring that different countries are investing in different parts of the electricity system or generation, the different energy value chains. And now I have big questions about kind of green industrial value chains, green steel, green aluminium, how they will look. And that's something where it's not possible that every single country in Europe builds this out. And it needs to be kind of value chains that break up and move around Europe. And that's something that Europe really lacks at the moment, this kind of investments union to try and drive investments around Europe and kind of break down value chains and benefit from comparative advantage, which I think will be something interesting to watch in the coming years. And we'll see what happens there. And then on the grids interconnection, I think also the big one to watch is on Spain indeed. And as you say, through the Pyrenees and connecting into France and into wider Europe just is seemingly, for electricity, has been a no-go. There's all the discussions on a hydrogen pipeline, if that's going to happen. And if it doesn't, and if Spain is not exporting energy as electrons or hydrogen molecules into the rest of Europe, my guess is Spain starts exporting other things, and that's going to be energy intensive commodities, because it's going to start making more and more sense to move your green steel factory, your green aluminium factory to Spain, which maybe, I mean, there's a nice kind of, you sit in Brussels and you try and solve the European puzzle, but you go and sit in Madrid or you sit in Berlin. Of course, that's the problem of Europe. That's why there's so many moving parts and competing interests.
Yeah, I think Ross Perot became famous for the giant sucking sound. It seems like if Spain is going to be an energy island and have free energy effectively, a lot of German industry might look at Spain and relocating. Maybe a final question, big picture of where you see this current energy crisis, which has been described as the mother of all energy crisis. Where do you see that pushing the European Union? The way I sort of see the debate is that there's kind of sort of a fossil fuel crowd that sort of sees, well, if you don't have gas, well, you'll start burning coal more, quite skeptical of renewables. To me, when I look at the European story, I think it's pretty clear that we're just going to see continued expansion. I think in Spain, we'll probably see a lot more battery deployment to deal with some of the curtailment. And we talked about solar in April is just, totally plentiful. But if you add more batteries, then you move that energy use to the evening. But I think we'll just sort of see Europe continue on its path, and probably the electrification story is going to, I would think skyrocket. If you're looking at buying a car right now or thinking about changing, it seems like EV, this is probably the best fuel for EV adoption, and heat pumps as well. So I'm curious, how do you see this sort of transforming Europe? Is it just going to kind of stay on the same course, or do you see this leading to kind of massive shifts? Do you see coal coming back online? How do you see this playing out not just over the next few months, but really over the next few years? When we're looking back on this crisis, as we started the conversation to look back on the crisis from 4 years ago, what do you think we'll be saying?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question. I think everything you said, I basically agree with. And I think all of those things will be pushed. I think it looks like this time it's going to be much more of an oil shock. In 2022, we saw the impact on gas, and we saw kind of demand drop 20% there, and lots of new things happening in that space to reduce gas demand. My suspicion is now we will see the same in oil. And again, as you say, buying an electric vehicle is a choice for 20 years. That's as you for yourself making the choice. That's then 20 years consumption, which is gone. And I think the March data are just coming out now. You see European electric vehicle sales are going up. So I think that this push for electrification, I think will happen in Europe. And I think we'll see an acceleration of electrification. I think politically we'll see, of course, increased focus on energy security. I think that was already happening. And I think energy security, there's this famous triangle of decarbonization or climate policy, energy security, and competitiveness. And they're always in competition, and you have to have some trade-offs. And for sure, energy security now, I think, is pushed to the front. The good news for climate, I think, is that there's an 80% correlation between energy security and climate stuff. That most of the things we're doing anyway for climate, heat pumps, electric vehicles, more renewables, more batteries, just make sense for everything, and that will happen. And so broadly, it's very good news, I think, for the transition. There'll be some edge cases, I think, where there might be a reassessment in Europe in terms, which I think also is kind of like the broader climate discussion now. It's a bit more pragmatic, and that kind of like missing 5% of the pie in an electricity system, for example, keeping some gas-fired power plants, even some coal-fired power plants, being a bit more relaxed. They run for 300 hours a year, and you pay them a little bit of money to sit there and be ready in December or in January in case you need them, and to kind of ensure that the system runs well and there's low grams of CO2 per electricity generated with a bit of fossil in there, perhaps just to get over these bumps. I think that's my guess would be that's kind of, and you kind of see governments talking about this kind of thing. I think that's where we'll arrive, is this doubling down on energy security, which 90% of that means clean energy, but there'll be some things for sure that don't quite mean clean energy, and some things that do mean perhaps going back on a few things that Europe thought, which we'll see folding out. Yeah, energy security and electrification, I guess, are the two big things.
Ben, thank you so much for joining Eurofile. It's been educational, a tour de force, tour de horizon of the European energy markets. Thanks so much.
No, thanks a lot. It was a pleasure to chat.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.